This video will walk you through the chain of events that leads to the Revolutionary War for Independence between the American colonists and the British. The American colonists who want to fight for freedom, we call them patriots. The ones who do not want to fight for freedom and stay loyal to the British, we call them loyalists. This slideshow takes you through the chain of events that's going to lead up to that fight. It is something that takes well over a decade, and in some cases, it is a couple hundred years in the making. So let's start with the Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts were a series of laws that governed trade between Britain and the colonies. Britain owned the colonies, and the whole point of Britain owning the colonies was to make money. So they did regulate trade as closely and as strictly as possible so they could make as much money as possible. They required the colonists to do the bulk of their trade with England. If they were going to trade with any other countries, they had to go through England so that England was getting a piece of the profit. They also set duties on some products. A duty is a tax. So this is how they are making money off of trade that is going to and from the American colonies. And this goes back to the 1600s when they first set up colonies in America. This is just the way it's always been. And for the most part, the colonists have pretty much just put up with it. But as time goes on, the colonists are wanting to be more and more independent, and so they're starting to get upset about it. They want more freedom, and they want free enterprise to do business however they see fit. They want to make as much profit as possible. They feel like they're putting in the work. They should be making the money. So they just want more control of their lives and their economy and their business. The British, of course, don't want to let go of that control. So they're going to start to clamp down on the Americans. The fact that the French and Indian War cost so much money and the Americans were sort of refusing to help pay for it is going to prompt the British to crack down and really start to enforce the Navigation Acts more strictly than they ever did before. And so the colonists are going to start smuggling goods. When you smuggle goods, that means that you are transporting them or trading them illegally. So in other words, they would try to import and export things without the British government knowing so that they wouldn't have to pay taxes on it. The British claim that this is good for the colonies because they'll always have a steady market. They'll always have a customer in England. England promises, we'll always buy your stuff and we will always help you find customers for your natural resources and products. So they kind of say, look, you're lucky to have us, so stop complaining. The colonists, though, want more freedom and more control over their trade. And so, of course, the French and Indian War is going to throw a big wrench into everything. And right after it ends in 1763, the British are going to have to come up with a way to raise money to help pay their war debts. Because remember, the Americans did not want to voluntarily give money to help them pay off their war debt. So in 1764, the British passed the Sugar Act, which sets taxes or duties on the shipping of molasses and sugar imports that are coming from the Caribbean. This is the first act that they pass specifically to raise money from the colonies. And the colonists aren't stupid. They see exactly what's going on. So they protest this taxation without representation. Remember, back in the French and Indian War, they were complaining about taxation without representation. And now it's just going to get to be an even stronger argument. Look, we shouldn't have to pay taxes to a government that does not allow us to have a representative in that government. So again, they're going to smuggle these things. They'll smuggle the molasses and sugar in from the Caribbean and try to get around the tax collectors. They're also going to start boycotting. This is the first that we see this, and it's not going to be the last that we see of it. Boycotting goods is a very effective way of protesting because it means you're refusing to buy it. And if you refuse to buy it, then the British aren't going to make any money off of it anyway. So that usually sends a very strong message. The colonists are going to start to organize here with the Sugar Act. They form what's called the Committees of Correspondence. Different patriots within the colonies are going to be publishing letters and editorials and pamphlets and posters, and they're going to be circulating that literature throughout the colonies, trying to get support for the boycotts and smuggling, and trying to get some other colonists to join in on their protests. The British are going to have to react to this because smuggling is illegal, so they're going to put the smugglers on trial. But they're going to do that without giving them a jury, and they're going to treat them guilty until proven innocent, which is the opposite of the way it's supposed to be. So it's not just a matter of paying taxes now. The British are actually taking away some of the civil rights of the colonists. So things are escalating. In 1765, the British government decides that the Sugar Act isn't working because of smuggling and boycotts. So the colonists are actually winning at this point. So in 1765, a year after the Sugar Act, the British passed what's called the Stamp Act. This is not a tax on stamps. This is a tax on paper items. The reason it's called the Stamp Act is because they used a stamp to prove that you paid your tax on that paper product. So if you went to buy a newspaper or a pamphlet or a deck of cards or something, they would, and you paid your tax on that item, they would stamp that item to prove that you paid your tax. It was like a receipt. So anything made of paper had this tax on it. Legal documents, pamphlets, playing cards, newspapers, anything on paper. And of course, back then, everything was on paper because they didn't have computers or the internet. So this is actually a really smart move on the British behalf. You need legal documents and you need things on paper. It's actually something that you can't really do without, like sugar. So this was kind of a smart move. But of course, the colonists aren't going to like it, and they're actually going to escalate their protests. They're going to form what's called the Sons of Liberty. That was a group of patriots in the American colonies that actually would use violence against tax collectors. They would go out and hunt them down and threaten them, sometimes actually attack them. They would pour hot tar on them and throw feathers on them. It was called tar and feathering. It became basically a terrorist organization that was terrorizing these tax collectors that were working on behalf of the British government. So things are starting to turn slightly violent here. The Americans are going to boycott these stamps and the paper products in a couple different ways. Some people just refused to buy paper products anymore, and they did everything they could to avoid it. And then you also had the people who were responsible for selling those stamps and collecting those taxes, and they would just refuse to do that. So they would sell their paper products without charging their customers the tax. That was another way that they could boycott. So again, boycotting is happening. The Americans sent over a group of people, including Benjamin Franklin, to ask Parliament to repeal the act, which means to get rid of it. So they tried diplomatic ways. They tried boycotting. They tried violence. They're trying a bunch of different ways to protest this, hoping that the British government will get rid of it. Now, the British government says, you guys are being ridiculous. This is a totally fair tax. The people who live over here in Britain are paying a similar tax. And you're always saying that you want to be treated like British subjects. Well, here we are. We're trying to treat you like British subjects. And look at what you're doing. So, it's like no matter what we do, you're not happy. But they do end up repealing it because the boycotts are hurting British businesses. So yet again, the boycotts are successful. However, after they repeal the Stamp Act, they pass what is called the Declaratory Act. And it said that Parliament had the right to pass any law they wished and that the Americans had to follow it no matter what. So in other words, It's them putting their foot down and saying, listen, we've given in to your demands twice now. We got rid of the Sugar Act, we got rid of the Stamp Act, but that's it. We're not doing it anymore. You guys just need to shut up and pay your taxes. You are British subjects, and we are not putting any unreasonable taxes on you that we haven't put on everyone else in the British Empire. So just go with it. This is just the way it is. So that's them putting their foot down, drawing a line in the sand, saying, that's it. Quit the protests, quit the boycotts, and quit the smuggling. All right, so that was the 1765 Act. A couple years later, the British government passes a series of acts called the Townshend Acts, named after the man who proposed those in Parliament. Now, this is going to tax a list of items, not just one thing. It's going to set import taxes on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. So the tax on paper is back, but they've also added some other products. Now, let's remember plastic didn't exist back then, so a lot of things are going to be stored in glass containers. So taxing glass is going to affect almost everybody in the colonies. Lead was a product that was used a lot because at this point they still didn't know about lead poisoning. So that is going to affect a lot of people. Paint, paper, tea. Tea was the most popular beverage in the colonies. So if you look at this list of things, it really is a list that affects everybody. There's no escaping it. It's easy to boycott sugar. It's not as easy, but you can still boycott paper products. But how do you boycott all of these things? That's what the British are thinking, so that's why they pass taxes on all of those. And the money that is used or collected through these taxes is going to be used to pay the military that is necessary to be in the colonies because of all of the protests. The Sons of Liberty are escalating their attacks and their terrorist behaviors. So the British government feels like they have to have a military over here to keep the peace. And they, of course, have governors over here in the colonies. So the money that is collected through these taxes is going to be used to pay those governors and the military that is now stationed over here in America. So yet again, I'm sure you're thinking, okay, just boycott again. They do. They do boycott British goods again. Of course, smuggling is still going on too. And the women start to get involved as well. They form the Daughters of Liberty. They're going to do things behind the scenes to support this patriot movement. They're not going to be violent like the Sons of Liberty, but they're going to do everything they can behind the scenes to support them. They are going to protest the presence of a standing army in the colonies. There has always been an agreement between the Americans and the British that there would not be a standing army in the colonies. And by standing army, I mean an army that's here all the time and just kind of patrolling the streets. It's always been an agreement that that wouldn't happen. But now that all the protests and the smuggling have been going on, the British feel like they have to have an army here. And of course, the Americans are going to protest that. The Americans, especially the Sons of Liberty, are also going to start attacking the houses of customs officials. When you import goods into a country, you have to go through customs. And that is where they will identify the goods that are to be taxed. So not only are tax collectors a target of the Sons of Liberty, now so are the customs officials that work in those offices. So these are the things the colonists are doing. Now, what are the British doing? They are going to use a legal term called writs of assistance to search for smuggled goods. That basically means that they can search your property, whether it's your house, your business, or your ship, without a warrant. They can just come on and say, we think you're smuggling, we're going to search your stuff. Now, what's going to happen in reaction to the Townshend Acts? There's going to be a protest in Boston, right there in the middle of the city of Boston, where colonists are yelling at the soldiers that are there and antagonizing them, calling them names, things like that. It does draw a crowd. It starts out with just a handful of people, but then a crowd gathers and they really start to escalate their insults, and eventually they start throwing things at the soldiers. So they're throwing things like bottles and snowballs and ice chunks, because this happens in March in Boston. So it's cold outside and they have snow and ice on the ground. They throw rocks at them. So in response to the colonists throwing things at them, those British soldiers end up firing their guns into the crowd and injuring and killing some people. This becomes known as the Boston Massacre. So when the Boston Massacre happens, the British government says, geez, things are really getting out of hand over there in America. Maybe we should get rid of some of these taxes because we can't have people shooting each other in the streets. So they do get rid of all of those taxes except the tax on tea, because things are just getting so out of hand. Now that leads us to, and this goes, this is passed in 1767, and 5 or 6 years go by where, there are protests and boycotts and things like that, but we don't really hear much out of Parliament until 1773 when they pass the Tea Act. The Tea Act is not a tax on tea. There was already a tax on tea from the Townshend Acts. The Tea Act just gives exclusive rights to one company, the East India Company, which is a British company, to sell their tea directly to the colonies. It eliminates the middleman, which would have been the American person that was importing, and then the retailer that was selling the tea to the consumer and making a living off of that. The goal here is to lower the price of tea, because if you buy tea direct from a supplier without going through a middleman, it is cheaper. And the British thought, if we can lower the price of tea, maybe the colonists will be more likely to actually buy it legally instead of smuggle it, and therefore they'll pay their taxes on that tea. So that is the goal here, is to lower the price of tea so that the Americans will actually buy it legally and pay the tax. The colonists, you can imagine, aren't going to like it because at this point, they don't like anything the British are doing. They're afraid that this cheap British tea is going to put Americans out of business, and it's going to create a monopoly for that company, the East India Company. And to be honest, they're right. It would, right? It is going to put Americans out of business. It is going to create a monopoly. There's no doubt about it. And this is when the famous Boston Tea Party happens, where you have the Sons of Liberty dressing up as Mohawk Indians. And it wasn't because they wanted people to think that Native Americans were doing this. It was just a disguise. It was like a costume. Think of it as a costume, just to hide their identities. They boarded some of the East India Company's ships in the middle of the night in the Boston Harbor, and they threw all of the tea that was on board those ships into the harbor, which of course ruins it, and it costs the East India Company, in today's dollars, millions of dollars. So this is a really big deal. The East India Company is obviously upset, and Parliament is upset back in Britain because yet again, the colonists are just refusing to comply with their rules. So they're really going to crack down this time. They've had enough. And the result of the Boston Tea Party is that they are going to pass what become known as the Intolerable Acts. In 1774, they release this list of rules. They close Boston Harbor, which is just going to cripple the city of Boston, and quite honestly, all of the New England colonies, because they rely on that port to get the things in and out of the country that they need. The Massachusetts Charter was canceled, so that takes away all of Massachusetts' self-governing freedoms. Royal officials are going to be sent to England for any trials. So if anyone working directly for the English royalty here in America is accused of a crime, instead of being put on trial here in America, they're going to be sent back home to be put on trial, which basically means they're going to be able to get away with whatever they want. The Quartering Act is part of this list. It is a law that says colonists must feed and shelter British soldiers if they show up at your door. So if a British soldier knocks on your door and says, I need a place to stay and you need to feed me for a while, you have to do that. You have to let them stay there and you have to feed them. And it could be indefinitely. So you can imagine that that would not make the colonists very happy. And finally, they also appointed a new governor for Massachusetts, somebody handpicked by the Parliament and the King of England, just to make sure that they are getting rid of anybody who has any leanings toward the patriot cause. So this is bad news. This is really, really bad news for the colonists, especially those living in Boston and Massachusetts and New England, really. Up to this point, the colonists all over the colonies, like in Pennsylvania, Maryland, the Carolinas, they were so far away from a lot of this protesting up in Boston that they just didn't really relate to it very much. People down in those more southern colonies are more rural. They're farmers. They're not really feeling the pinch that these city folk are feeling up in New England. So up to this point, it's really been that the protests have been focused in big cities like Boston, New York, and maybe Philadelphia. But now that the Intolerable Acts have been released, that's going to change. Obviously, the colonists are upset that their rights are being violated. It's more than just paying taxes. As you can see from this list of acts that were passed, there are no taxes anymore. Like, it's not about taxes. Now it's about punishment. The colonists are going to start publishing propaganda, which is anything that is created to support your point of view. It could be pamphlets, it could be posters, it could be editorials in newspapers, it could be books, essays, anything that can get the word out. In today's world, if you were to do that, you would go on social media, right? That's the fastest way to publish your opinion and to try to get support for your opinion. But back then they had to actually print things and mail them out and post them in public places. So they're really going to ramp up that propaganda to try to get support from all of the colonies. Because the people of Boston and New York and Philadelphia up to this point have felt like they were sort of on their own. They are still trying to boycott British goods, whether there are taxes on them or not. But all of this is going to work. The Intolerable Acts were meant to punish the colonists and get them under control. But the unintended consequence is that it actually united them as a group. It brought a lot of Americans together for them to finally stand up and say, we're not going to take it anymore. The year was 1774. And about a year later, the first shots will be fired in this war for independence. And of course, not surprisingly, those first shots are fired in the colony of Massachusetts. So that is the chain of events that leads to the first shots being fired. As you can see, it wasn't just one event. It was a very long chain of events that lasted quite a few years and finally ended with everybody just throwing their hands up and saying, we're done. We can't do this anymore. Let me know if you have any questions.